So I just finished reading The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. And the book is a journey through his founding of the company LoudCloud, which is basically the first mention of the word cloud, referring to computer servers and computing, things like that. And now today we know everyone has their cloud storage, and companies like Apple and Google are doing it, but LoudCloud was really the first one to kind of connect cloud to computing. Now, the company was founded in 1999, and soon after it quickly grew to something like 400 employees, millions and millions in revenue, and they were doing great. But then the dot-com bubble happened, and basically they lost almost all of their customers. Now, right after this, they're struggling to stay alive, and they have 3 weeks of cash in the bank before they're completely out of business. And basically, the CEO, Ben Horowitz, decides that he is going to try an IPO and take the company public. And they're trying to do it really quickly because they can't raise money from anyone. No private investors are investing in this, but they see a little bit of hope in the public market. So they try to take it public, and they're eventually successful. In taking it public, they survive to live a little bit longer, and then, the stock kind of starts crashing. Things out of their control happen a lot, just like the way that the stock analysts describe things make it seem bad or something, or they had to try to keep this one customer that was super important. And in one instance, they had this one customer who was, I think, 90% of all of their revenue, and he was like, I hate you guys, I'm never using your service again. So they were like, okay, what can we do to help? Can we fix this? How much time will you give us to completely fix our software so that it works perfectly for you? Because otherwise they're completely destroyed, their entire company. So he says they can have 60 days. And then they find out that the company that he works for is also switching over to a free software from the current paid one that they use. This is a separate software. And the guy who wants that software, he wants the paid software, but they're switching over to the free one. He doesn't have a choice. He's the one you need to influence to keep your software if you are LoudCloud. So they decide to acquire the company that he wanted the paid software from, give that software to him for free with their software that they're already selling him. And it was this super complicated thing where they had to acquire the company in 60 days and also fix their software to guarantee that they kept the customer. And eventually he was so happy, he was amazed, and they kept the contract with that company and saved their company there. Now, basically what I learned from the book was that he talks a lot about wartime and peacetime CEOs. He was called a good peacetime and wartime CEO, which was super rare. Someone said he was better than Steve Jobs, and then he was like, I was a peacetime CEO for about 3 days, and then wartime for 8 years or whatever. So he really emphasizes how all the business books he would read, and he didn't really have that much time to read because he was spending so much time working and trying to keep his company afloat. All those books were about peacetime, and there are a few about wartime. Really none address the duality that there even is two that exists. There are two different ones. There's a wartime, there's a peacetime, and the methods are completely different. A lot of the peacetime methods are completely the opposite of the wartime methods. A lot of business books are like, oh, you have to be super nice to your employees and never curse or anything. And then he says wartime CEOs have to curse on purpose to emphasize their point at times, and all these different things. The peaceful books, he said, say, drop any business that you're not number 1 or number 2 at. And he's like, well, we're not 1 or 2 at anything. We're number 12 at everything we do. We're not the best. We don't have that luxury. We have to operate as a wartime company, and I have to be a wartime CEO. And I really like that duality because I see that a lot. I'll read a book. I don't know what a good example is. There's a lot of those super idealistic. Toyota Production System is kind of in the middle. I'm trying to think something like a Disney where everything, you're paying attention to every detail, making sure everything's perfect. Then that would be a book like Disney War or something like that. And then you have a book like The Prince, where basically it's the exact opposite and do like all the worst stuff possible, and both will attain a similar outcome. Be Our Guest is the book I was thinking of for Disney. Disney War I want to read, but I haven't yet. Anyway, back to this book. He said that in the wartime, people actually look back at their wartime as being happier. Not the CEO, but his employees. He was always worried to be negative around his employees. He always thought he had to be positive. And then he found out one day that they knew things were bad, a couple of them at least, and they were like, why do you always have to like keep pretending everything's perfect? We're not kids, like we understand this. And then he's like, oh wait, I'm basically the CEO and the owner of the company. I'm the one who doesn't want things to be bad. They're perfectly fine with it. Like, they're more able to help. They don't have to be scared because they know they can always go somewhere else. This is like my thing. So he said like to always tell your employees when things are going on that's bad. The other thing about that is the rosy remembering that I talked about in another book, Brand Washed. They talk about how rosy remembering basically takes away the negatives when you look back on your past, and it makes you just remember the positive. So like you don't remember last year when you were grinding it out and working 16-hour days, you just remember your accomplishments, and you're like, oh yeah, you kind of push away the 16-hour work days to the side, and you're like, oh yeah, I was working so hard with everyone and we're getting so much done. That's what you remember, and that's really what sticks, and why you have to be a wartime CEO sometimes, and why people actually enjoy that more than the peacetime CEO in many situations. Now, he also says that leaders aren't born, and kind of relates this to the wartime and the peacetime. He says that leaders aren't born, and it's inherently unnatural. You have to do a lot of unnatural things. He says, if your friend tells you a joke, you're gonna either pretend to laugh or not laugh or whatever, but he says you're never going to be like, you know, I didn't like the delivery and the timing was a little off, so if you could just like rethink that and then come back and present it to me tomorrow. He says like that'll never happen with your friends or whatever, but as a CEO, that's literally like what you're doing all day. Like it's not a natural thing to be a leader of a company, but you have to learn how to do it. And it's not something that people can naturally ever do because it's just so unnatural. He talks about how boxers have to learn to step back with their foot that's already back, and how that's an unnatural movement that they have to learn to be better at what they're doing, even though it's like the opposite of what you would do instinctually. So no one's born knowing to move that way. You just have to learn it over time. He also says the last thing, is at the very end of the book, he says that how he decided to sell his company. He kind of valued it before selling it. So he would always think in his head, like, I think we're going to grow this much, and then the value will be this much. So it's only almost like from day one, before he even founded it, he knew what he would want to sell it for, like the price he would sell it for, because he kind of had the potential in his head. And then he was like, oh, at this year, if we're doing this much revenue, it'll be worth this much money. Basically calculated that based on the potential of the company. If he thinks, like, I can double this company next year, he's not going to sell it for 2 years of profits, obviously. But if he thinks, I can increase the revenue by 20% next year, then he might sell it for 2 or 3 years of profits, no problem. And he ends up selling the company for $1.6 billion, and then he starts a venture capital firm where he only hires people who have experience with companies rather than those analysts that he talks about with the business books of the peacetime. So he hires people who actually know what they're doing rather than just the teachers and analysts who've never actually led anything.